The objectives for today is I'm hoping that you'll be able to choose the correct variety of blueberries for your situation. You will learn proper planting techniques and soil improvement, learn proper care for plants, including fertilizing, watering, and pruning, and be aware of some of the possible pest problems and solutions for those problems. So let's start from the beginning. What do you need to know about purchasing your blueberry plants? When purchasing your blueberry plants, of course, you're going to want to buy the ones that are as healthy as can be. You always do that when you go to buy a plant, right? You will probably be buying plants that are grown in either 1 or 2 gallon containers. Now, some of you may be able to purchase bare root plants, but most of the time they're going to be in 1 or 2 gallon containers. That's how they sell them in the nurseries for the home gardener. 2 or 3-year-old plants are best. They need to have a good start before we put them into the ground. You need to check to see if they're root bound, and you'll be able to tell if there's any roots hanging around the top of the soil. The plant should have several shoots coming up from the soil, not just 1 or 2, but as many as you can see. And also try to buy plants that don't have flowers on them. I know that's going to be hard to do, but I'm going to tell you to pull those flowers off anyway. So you might as well start with a plant that doesn't have any flower buds. Okay, you know what you're going to look for in a blueberry plant, but you still need to decide what variety you're going to buy. And you're going to want to figure this out before you go to the nursery to buy your plants. In the nurseries, you're going to find several different types of blueberries to choose from. Some of them do better in our areas than others. And here is a list that I'm going to go through for you. Northern highbush is the most common blueberry grown here in the Pacific Northwest. That's because it does get the highest yields. It will grow 5 to 10 feet tall, but you can control it by pruning. And like I said, it gets very high yields here in our area. Southern highbush gets very low yields in the Pacific Northwest. So if you do see some southern highbush around, that's not a good idea to purchase them if you're living in our area. Rabbit eye are not recommended for the Pacific Northwest at all. You will see some low bush, but you'll seldom see them sold around our area. In other areas of the state or in other areas of the country, if you're listening to, those may be more available for your area. Half highs you will see a lot here. They are a cross between a northern high bush and a low bush. And they're a little bit smaller than a northern high bush, so they're really well suited for containers. Now, OSU has an extension publication called Blueberry Cultivars for the Pacific Northwest. If you look through this publication before you purchase your plants, I think that you will be very happy you did, because this publication will give you all kinds of information about each variety, each cultivar that is listed. They'll tell the bush size and how vigorous it is, the berry size and what flavor they think it has. It will tell you a little bit about some disease resistant, the fruit yield, the harvest season, and whether it's a good variety for home use or better suited for commercial use. Now, the northern high bush blueberries that I mentioned that we grow a lot around here, they are self-fruitful. That means you can have just one blueberry plant and you will get blueberries. But if you have more than one variety or more than one cultivar, those words are kind of interchangeable there, you will get not only more berries on your bushes, but you will get larger berries too. Now, blueberries come in early, mid, and late season varieties. So if you were to buy a few early, mid, and late season varieties, you could actually be harvesting your blueberries anywhere from mid-June to mid-September. And once again, talking about northern high bush, they grow 5 to 9 feet tall. They will grow in about a 4-foot wide area. And if you take really good care of your blueberries and follow all the directions that OSU gives you, and your bush is mature, a mature bush is anywhere from 6 to 8 years old, you should get 10 to 15 pounds of blueberries per bush. Now, I've listed just a few of the many varieties that are available, Duke being the earliest variety and Elliott being the latest variety. Now, since you'll be going to all that work planting your blueberries, you're probably going to want to know how long you can enjoy the fruits of your labor, so to speak. So let's find out. If you take really good care of your plants and you follow the information given by OSU, your blueberries should live 50 years or more. And I even know of some fields that are almost up to 100 years old already. Your bush should have dark green foliage and they should produce 10 to 12-inch long branch growth a year. That means that during the summertime when your blueberry bush is putting on new growth, it should be able to produce long branches 10 to 12 inches long. And like I mentioned before, if you take really good care of your plant, you should get 10 to 15 pounds of blueberries per bush. Now that you figured out what blueberries you want to plant, there are a few things that you need to take care of before you put them in the ground. The first thing you're going to do is select the site for your blueberries. You're going to want to choose an area with full sun. They will grow in partial shade, but you will get a poorer yield and the fruit quality won't be nearly as good as it is if you plant them in full sun. Try to keep them away from an area that has tall trees. The roots of these tall trees will reach into the area where your blueberries are, and they will take up all the water and nutrients that you want to go to those plants. So be very careful if you're planting them near a lot of tall trees. Also, it's very, very important, I can't stress that enough, to have your soil tested before you plant your blueberries. And I'll talk about that in a little bit later some more too. But blueberries need a pH that's very acidic, 4.5 to 5.5. Before you plant, you're going to be adding some organic matter into your soil as an amendment. And I will also talk about that in the next slide or two also. Try to plant them in an area that has fertile, well-drained soils because blueberries are very sensitive to wet and heavy soils. But having said that, in our area, we have a lot of heavy clay soils. So that's why we're going to be adding the organic matter to our soils to make it more fertile and better drained. So soil pH is one of the most important factors when growing blueberries. And like I mentioned, the ideal soil pH is somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5. If you test your soil and you find out that it's somewhere between 5.5 and 5.7, you won't have to use sulfur to lower it. The fertilizer that you're going to be putting on your blueberries will, over time, lower your pH a little bit to the numbers that you want. But if you test your soil and you find that it is above 5.7, you're going to have to add what is called elemental sulfur. This will lower the pH, but it will lower the pH very slowly. It takes several months. If you do use elemental sulfur, I will tell you to be very, very careful. Too much can be harmful, not enough. Well, if you're not sure, maybe I better start over for that. Sorry about that. Definitely always read the directions on the package. Read the directions on any of the packages that you purchase. And apply that slowly. Try it a little bit. Check it in a couple months. See if it's lowered at all. If not, maybe add just a little bit more and then check it again. But don't put a whole lot on all at one time or you are going to injure your blueberries. The majority of blueberry plants, like I mentioned, is caused by the pH being too high. And that's one of the problems that is the problem with this little bush that you see on the left-hand side. When your soil pH is too high, your plant cannot take up some of the nutrients need. In fact, iron deficiency is a big one. That's because it's called Lyme-induced iron deficiency. Your pH is too high. The iron that is in your soil cannot be taken up through the plant. That's why it is so important for blueberries to have a low pH, 4.5 to 5.5. I said that about 5 times now, haven't I? But it is one of the most important things. The other thing that's a problem with this plant is the weeds. Those weeds that you see, the weeds and grasses under that plant, they're not going to allow the plant to take up the nutrients or water. The weeds are going to get all of that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. So if your soil is not ideal, mixing in organic matter will help the blueberries to grow best. And it is best to have an organic matter of greater than 4%. Now you might thinking, well, how am I going to know it's 4%? And I wanted to know that too. So I looked it up and there is a formula. You'll have to look up and there's a formula that tells you how much soil you need, how much organic matter to make how much percentage you want. So there's a little homework for you there. You're going to want to choose an organic matter that is low in pH. Sawdust or bark from Douglas fir or pine or most hardwoods. Fresh cedar and fresh redwood do not work well. They they will damage your blueberry plants. Also, avoid manures and compost because they are high in pH and high in salts. Now, I am talking about adding the organic matter to your soil as an amendment. That means this organic matter is going to be worked into your soil. That's why I'm telling you to avoid manures and compost because you don't want those mixed in with your soil. That's different than the mulch that I'm going to talk about in a minute. All right, now, okay, everything looks good. Your place you're going to put them looks great. Now, you are ready to plant. So you're going to probably, like I mentioned, you're probably going to be buying your plant in a container. So you want to plant it the same depth that it was in the container. You want to space the high bush blueberries about 3 to 4 feet apart. Some of the lower bush ones, you might be able to put them a little closer together. Then you're going to want to put mulch on the top, sawdust or bark. Now, using compost is okay, as long as you do not mix it into the soil. Remember what I just talked about. An amendment is different than a mulch. A mulch stays on top of the soil, an amendment is worked into the soil. So if you're going to use compost as a mulch on top of the soil, do not let it get mixed in like an amendment would. You're going to water the plants, and this is where everybody hates me to say this, but you're going to prune off all of the flower buds. And remember, try to choose more than one variety of blueberry. Even if you only have 2 plants, have 2 different varieties, your 2 favorite varieties. That way you will get more berries and they will be larger too. Now, adding mulch to your blueberry plants will help suppress the weeds and retain the water. The mulch also keeps the roots cool in summer and warm in winter. Once again, like I just mentioned, when you're planting your plants, the same thing here. Use sawdust or bark. Compost is only okay if it's not mixed into the soil. And what you're going to do with this mulch is the first year you're going to add about 2 inches of mulch, and then you're going to increase that mulch to a depth of 6 inches over about 6 years. But be careful that you don't put the mulch right up against the trunk of that blueberry bush. Have it a little bit farther away from it. Now, some of you may not have room to plant blueberries in the landscape, so you'll be happy to know that they grow really well in containers. But the thing you need to know about growing in a container, especially with blueberries because of the pH that they need, you can't just go out and buy a normal potting soil, and you can't use soil from your own landscape soil because it's too thick and too heavy. So the perfect amount to use for a container for blueberries is well-aged fine bark, about 50 to 80%, peat moss, about 10 to 40%, and either perlite or pumice for 10%. Now, before I get a question, because I know a lot of people are going to say, wait a minute, OSU is telling us not to use peat moss because it might not be a renewable resource. If you do not want to use peat moss, coconut coir will work just as well. Now, if you want to put a high bush blueberry in a container, that's fine. It needs to be about the size of a half a whiskey barrel or maybe a 10 to 20 gallon container. If you're using a half high, it could be a little bit smaller, a 10-gallon container or larger. Now, weeding, and I'll tell you, that's the same look that I get on my face when I'm weeding too. So let's talk about weeding those blueberries. It's definitely best to keep your blueberries free from weeds. Weeds compete for the water and nutrients. It's also important that you're going to weed by hand. That's why it's good to put all that mulch on to try to keep these weeds away. You're going to want to stay clear of those shallow roots. Blueberries do have a taproot that goes down deep, but they also have what we call feather roots, and they're all little tiny roots really near the surface. And if you're taking some kind of a tool in there to get out a weed, you're probably going to hook it on those pretty little feather roots and rip them off of your plant. So that's why it's best to use mulch and to weed by hand. Try to keep about a 4-foot area around your bush free from weeds. And don't use any herbicides that are made for woody plants. Blueberry is a woody plant. And if you put an herbicide near your woody plants, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, with our climate change, irrigation has become even more important. Blueberries do need a lot of water. They need about 1.5 to 3 inches of water a week during the growing season, all during the growing season. You want to water evenly to a depth of about 1/2 foot to 1 foot. And you'll need to, you need to water your plants and then wait a few hours and dig down and see how far down your water actually goes. Of course, it's best if they're watered from the base. This will help conserve water and also reduce weeds. So you can use soaker hoses, you can use drip irrigation, things like that. Now, one thing I want you to know is that next year's fruit buds are formed at the end of summer. And a lot of us, once our blueberries have been harvested, we kind of forget about those blueberry plants. Well, I want to tell you, don't forget about them. Please continue to water your plants until we get our heavy fall rains. The more they're watered late in the season, the more fruit will be able to set the following year. Now, the photo that you see at the bottom of this slide, that is a picture of a drought or water stress plant. You can see brown leaves or the burning tips. If you see that on your plants, that's a good indication that you have not been watering your plants enough. All right, now let's talk about fertilizing. The main ingredient needed by blueberries plants after planting and in all home gardens is just nitrogen. And it's the ammonium source of nitrogen, not the nitrate form. I can't stress that enough. Make sure you never put ammonium nitrate if you're using a synthetic. Make sure you use ammonium sulfate. Okay. If you want to use an organic fertilizer, feather meal and blood meal are two really good options because they're both high. They are the highest in nitrogen and they don't have any phosphorus or potassium. If you're using a synthetic, ammonium sulfate or urea are two good choices. You're going to be applying your fertilizer if you're using synthetic in late April, late May, and late June. But you need to know that organics take longer to release. An organic fertilizer will not release its nutrients into the soil as quickly as a synthetic. So you're going to want to start your organic fertilizers about a month earlier. Now, I'm not going to tell you specifically how much to put on your plants because all of you are going to have different size plants. They're going to be a different age. You're going to be using a different fertilizer. So definitely check out those Oregon State University publications, Growing Blueberries in Your Home Garden, and they will give you detailed information about how much fertilizer to put on your plant. The one thing I can tell you about fertilizers is blueberries cannot translocate. That means they can't take, if you put fertilizer only on one side of your plant, that blueberry bush could not take up the fertilizer on the other side of the plant. So what you need to do is you need to remove the mulch, put the fertilizer in a circle about 12 to 18 inches away from the crown, put the mulch back on, and then water it in really good. Okay, pollination. In order to set fruit, the flowers of blueberry plants must be pollinated by insects. So how do we get those insects to our garden area? Well, that's going to be another webinar that you'll be able to listen to soon. So for our blueberry plants, mason bees are very good pollinators because blueberries a lot of times will set their flowers and their flowers blossoms will open up when our weather is still cold and is still cool or still wet. And honeybees and bumblebees don't like cool, wet weather. But you know what? Mason bees, they do. So mason bees are a really good pollinator. Yes, bumblebees and honeybees do really well when the weather warms up a little bit. And we will be having another webinar also on mason bees. So if you're thinking about growing blueberries and you're thinking you might need some mason bees to help pollinate them, that webinar is going to be for you. All right, blueberries are really actually quite easy to grow and cared for properly. You will have few problems, but there are a few things you may come across down your blueberry plants, and we'll talk about those. Mummyberry fungus is very common in the Willamette Valley and southwestern Oregon. The symptoms of mummyberry are the flowers, the infected flowers may turn brown and wither. The stems on your blueberry plant might turn dark brown and you'll see the little necrosis, dead areas on it. And also the blighted flowers may have this brown gray mass of spores. And then if they do form blueberries, they will be pinkish in color. You can see those pictures of those blueberries. Some of them are blue. Those are good. The ones that are pink are not. Trust me, never eat one of those pink ones. Oh, they taste awful. Now the management for it is the mummy berries. All right, sorry about that. Let me start over. Sanitation is what's most important because if those mummy berries fall onto the ground next spring, right when the blossoms are starting to open on your blueberry plant, those little mummies are going to open up and they're going to send their fungal spores into the air and they are going to reinfect your plants again. So definitely pick up any mummified fruit you find on the ground, pick those pink ones off of the bush and dispose of them away from your blueberry plants into the garbage. And one thing you can do, you might, if you think you do have some mummies on the ground, smother them up. Maybe before the next spring's flowers blossom, cover them up with mulch or fluff up that mulch. That way, if you fluff up the mulch, any mummies down there will send their spores up, but there won't be any flowers to cause a problem yet. So that's how to take care of mummyberry. Blueberry shock virus is transmitted by bees when they move from flower to flower. And the symptoms are the flowers and the shoots will die in early spring. Sometimes the entire bush might be blighted. You might not have a leaf or a flower left on it. A lot of times it's only part of the bush. But you just need to let it run its course because this is a virus. And once this plant is done, it's going to resprout. It will grow new flowers. It will grow, not this year, sorry, it will grow new leaves this year, but it won't grow new flowers until the following year or maybe two. But after that, your bush will be fine. And you can see these pictures from OSU. The one on the left shows a blighted blueberry bush that had shock virus, and the one on the right shows the end of summer after it finally ran its course and the plant did recover. Next year, that plant will have a lot of good berries on it. Bacterial blight is something we've been seeing a lot of lately, unfortunately, but one of the easy ways to tell you have bacterial blight, sometimes people call it bacterial canker. You'll find those two words kind of interchanged there. It only happens on the previous season's growth, only on the previous season's canes. So if you have some dead canes on your blueberry plant and it's only last year's growth, you'll know that's a good indication that you have bacterial blight. First, you might see some water-soaked lesions that appear on the canes in winter, like January or February. And those of you that are watching this live right now, you might go take a look at your plants and see if you have that problem. Then you'll see some reddish to brown-black cankers, cankers meaning dead areas, might appear on the canes, and then all the buds in that area will be killed too. So the management for bacterial blight or bacterial canker is to prune out any disease wood you find. Try to avoid winter injury. That may sometimes cause the bacteria to enter the plant. Also, if you have a cultivar that you know is susceptible to it, try to make sure that you prune it during dry weather, not when it's raining or when we're going to have some ice. That will help keep the bacteria away. Now, as far as insects, the spotted winged Drosophila is the most important pest we have in blueberry production in Western Oregon. This is a fruit fly, but it is not a fruit fly, excuse me, that you're used to seeing. We're used to seeing fruit flies on our fruit and berries once they started to rot. But with the spotted winged Drosophila, we also just call it SWD, she lays her eggs in the berries as they are on your bushes. And they also, the spotted winged Drosophila also happens to any soft fruit or soft berries. There's a lot of edibles that this little girl invades. So the symptoms are you may see some scarring or spotting on the berry. And if you give it a little squeeze, you'll see the liquid start come out of those little spots. And then if you really squish it, you'll know that the berry is very soft and it collapses. And if you look inside, like the photo you can see in this middle photo here, you can see that small white larva or sometimes you'll see the pupa, sometimes you will see the eggs that she has laid inside of that. Sanitation will reduce the populations, and apple cider vinegar traps work really well, and I'll show you that on the next slide. I will tell you that the late harvested varieties are more susceptible because unfortunately these little girls have multiple how do you say that? Generations, multiple generations during the summer. So they do get thicker towards the end. You'll have less problem with your early varieties, ripening varieties, than you will with your late ripening varieties. So if you go to Oregon State Extension publications, you will see a publication telling you all about how to make these spotted winged Drosophila traps. As you can see by these two pictures, they've experimented with different ways to do it. It's just a cup with a lid on it filled with apple cider vinegar. Sometimes people think red's better. Sometimes people think clear works better. That clear one actually has a yellow sticky trap inside just so the person can see what insects have gone in there and get stuck. So if you think you might have trouble with these little spotted winged Drosophilas, definitely look up how to make these spotted winged Drosophila traps and put them out before your blooms or before your berries come into production. Now, how to prune a blueberry is one of the questions I get most often. So we're going to go through this. The objectives for pruning a blueberry bush are two things. You want to promote growth of strong new wood, and you want to maintain really good fruit production. Now, I will tell you, it takes a little practice. If you prune your blueberry bush really hard one year, that next season, you're going to get a lot of new growth. It's going to be beautiful, but you might not get a lot of berries. If you don't prune your blueberries bushes every year, you're not going to get much growth. And those blueberries are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller as time goes on. Blueberries grow best on wood that is 1 to 5 years old. So we're going to try to keep our blueberry bushes young. We're going to try to keep them 1 to 5 years old their whole life. Now, pruning the young plants. Say you're going to buy a plant this year. You found exactly what you wanted. You brought it home from the nursery. After you plant it, you're going to want to prune off about 30 or 40% of that bush. I know that sounds harsh, but following these steps will ensure strong and vegetative top and root growth the first year. Plants put their energy into fruit production at too young of an age, they may never recover, and they will continue to yield less than a well-pruned bush. So prune off that 30 to 40%. Remove any old growth. You might not have too much because your plant's probably only going to be 2 or 3 years old. Prune off all the fruit buds, all the flower buds. Remove anything that's really close to the soil, any thin, twiggy growth, and then you're going to want to top them. Cut off the branches at the top. That will encourage laterals to grow sideways, which will they put out the laterals, you'll get the fruit for the next year. So second year you have your plants in the ground, you're going to want to remove some of the flower buds and shape the bush. If you have a really vigorous plant, you can let it produce a limited crop, but I would take off a few of those berries because remember, you want all that energy to go into the plant so that it can live its long life being very healthy and giving you a lot of blueberries. So pruning blueberry bushes is really kind of fun once you get the hang of it. And if you just follow a few steps, you should have pretty good luck. I'm going to go through each one of these steps in the following slides. Remember what I said, the best fruit is produced on 6 to 12-inch long laterals, shoots. That's what we're going for, shoots that come off of the bush and are nice and long. So let's go through these step by step. Excuse me, I don't want to take too much time here. All right, pruning your blueberries. First of all, you're going to prune out any dead or diseased branches. You do that with anything. If you leave a diseased or dead branch on the bush, that just encourages more diseases to come in. So that's the first thing you're going to do. Then you're going to cut out branches that were shorter than your knees. In other words, sometimes we get a branch that grows very, very late in the season from the ground up. This one here is only about 6 or 8 inches tall. It's never going to produce any good berries. It's never going to get much longer. So cut those little ones off. And then if you find a branch that's low towards the ground and it might be long, but it's really thin, thinner than a pencil lead, really weak. If you have berry buds on the tip, all those blueberries are going to end up on the ground, and the only thing that's going to eat them are the insects or the other critters down there. So cut off any weak branches that would touch the ground when they were full of blueberries. Then you're going to prune out one or two of the old unproductive canes. Remember, I said we want to keep our blueberries we want to keep them, 1 to 5 years old, something like that. So you can tell the difference here. The old blueberry canes look like they've got bark on them, and you can see those nice new reddish colored ones. So by cutting out some of the older canes, you're going to encourage new canes to grow. So your bush will always be nice and young. Then you're going to cut out the twiggy wood. That's what we call it around here. We call it twiggy wood. You notice all those little tiny branches are only about 1 or 2 inches long. Do you remember I said that blueberries grow best on 6 to 12 inch long branches? They're not going to, the berries that do produce on these little tiny, tiny branches are not going to be very big, and they're not going to be very sweet. So you're going to cut out all of the twiggy wood. And the last thing you're going to do is thin out the center a little bit to allow light. They want that sunshine, so you'll be able to give it to them. Now here is a before and after picture of this bush. This bush had been in the ground about 4 years. So you can look at both sides and see that some of the old wood came out, a lot of the twiggy wood came out, some of the branches that were really low to the ground came out. And here is a picture of what came off of that bush. Now, if some of this didn't make much sense to you and you more like hands-on, we have a pruning blueberry video at our 10 Million University website. So you go there, and this pruning video will give you step by step just what we talked about on how to prune your blueberry plant. Now, birds can definitely be a big problem with berry crops, as I'm sure most of you know. And the only way to really keep the birds out would be to put your berries in an enclosed wire or netting. And the picture on the top is a picture of a fellow master gardener, Marie, whose father built her this enclosure so that she could put her blueberries inside and not have to worry about the birds. Her enclosure is built with wire, but you could also use bird netting. Now, the other thing you might try, I will tell you it doesn't work very well, but you might try some of these blow up things. Like they have blow up giant eyes and blow up snakes. There's these shiny bird scare tape you might try. You might try some plastic owls. If you do decide to use some type of device like that, be sure that you put up these scare devices before the berries ripen and continually move them from place to place. Trust me, I know of a little kitty that likes to sit on top of one of these owls. So it definitely needs to be moved from place to place so the birds think that that is real. Now, after you see your blueberries turning blue, if you wait a few days, they will sweeten up. But be careful while you're waiting that the birds don't come in and get them from you.
Well,
Hi, Cheryl.
you're making me wishing it was spring.
I know. Can't wait to eat those.
Yeah, I know. And judging from the number of people we have had listening today, everyone feels the same way. We're kind of finished with winter. We'd like to move on.
Yeah.
We have a few questions for you today.
Good.
The first one is for someone who lives in Port Townsend, Washington. It's a little bit out of our area, but she has blueberries that are only about 2 feet tall, and they're 4 years old. Not many berries, and she says, I'm really a good gardener. I have a great vegetable garden and other things grow well for me. What am I doing wrong? Is the pH too high? Should she add sulfur? And she wants to know if maybe you have an idea.
Okay. First thing, what kind does she have? Does she have a low bush or a southern? Did she have, a half high that only doesn't get very tall? So that's the first thing. If it happens to be a northern high bush, then probably something in the soil is going wrong. And she needs to do a soil pH test first. Don't add anything until after you do a soil pH test to find out exactly what it is. And then she probably, after listening to the program, probably got a few more ideas. So I'm hoping. But the first thing I would do is tell her to figure out what type of berry she has.
Since she doesn't live in our area and pH, she did want to know how do I learn what my pH is? So is it your recommendation that they contact their local county extension and see if they do pH testing? And if they don't, see if they have resources that tell them where to take their soil.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you, Cheryl, for reminding me about that.
Yep. Soil pH was, that was a repeated question. So several people were wondering, how do I know what my pH is? I don't know how to find out. Okay, so another question. These folks have 8-year-old blueberries, and suddenly the outer edges of the leaves began to brown, and then the whole leaf was brown, and then the plants seemed to start dying. Do you think that's due to water? They're concerned about the water.
Yeah, that is a big concern. And when you do water your plant, the one thing to know whether you have enough water on your blueberry plant or any plants that you're trying to water, after you water them, wait a few hours and then carefully dig down and find out how far down that water actually goes. But there are several reasons why blueberry leaves might turn, I mean, brown is mostly because of less water. And I don't know if this person saw the photo of a droughted blueberry bush. So I would try that first. Find out for yourself by actually digging down and seeing if the water went where it was supposed to go. And they need 1.5 to 3 inches of water a week during our summer and when we're not having any rain. And that is quite a bit of water.
And that is a bit of a challenge because unless you have a drip system to keep it evenly moist without drying out, is hard, which is why the mulch can be very extremely helpful to keep
Yes.
that plant moist. Is great. This gentleman has blueberries that are 20 years old with reddish leaves, and I know they get reddish in the fall. And
Yes.
he's concerned about that and wonders should he move them? Um, and
No, no, I would not move them. And I did answer this question to this gentleman
oh,
too.
good.
Um, there's several reasons why they could be. Could be extreme weather conditions, cool and then very, very hot. It could be having to do with not enough water also. Sometimes it's possible that there's not enough phosphorus in the soil. That's usually not a problem in our area. We seem to have enough phosphorus, but there are several reasons. If we could see photos of that plant, and a little bit more information on what time of year they're turning red and what he's doing with his plant, how he's taking care of it. I think we could answer that question better. So if he wants to send some pictures into the 10-Minute University website, we'll try to answer that better.
Okay, that's great. Good answer. We had 2 or 3, actually 4 or 5 more questions about interplanting. What plants are best for interplanting? Is interplanting a wise thing? Why is that smart to do? And if so, what's your experience with interplanting blueberries?
Blueberries don't like to be interplanted with things. We say that the blueberry needs a 4-foot area around it. So 2 feet on all sides of the blueberry without anything else planted. If you wanted, I know some people like to plant things, they have rows of blueberries. Yes, you can plant things in between the rows, a cover crop or grass or even some herbs or things like that, but keep the 4-foot area around your plant free from other plants. They just use up the nutrients, they use up the water, and and then it's also harder to get in there and know when there's a weed to pull the weeds out because you have the other plants in there too.
Right. Excellent. We had several questions on interplanting, so I'm glad. And of course, pH concerns and so forth. So that's a perfect answer. Best time to transplant your blueberries?
In the fall, October, first part of November, before it gets too cold, you need to cut them down a bit first. Cut probably maybe a third of them off, like prune them, and then dig as large of a root ball as you possibly can, and then transplant them. They do transplant really well. You probably won't have a very big crop the first summer after transplanting them, but they should put on a lot of new growth that year. So the next year, you'll have a pretty good size crop.
I'm going to segue with this next question. This was interesting. This couple transplanted mature plants from one home to another. I assume they moved. But the blueberry plants just never seem to recover. There's not much foliage, not too many blossoms, and not too many berries. And they're wondering any recommendations for how to revive them.
Yeah, as long as you're doing everything well with the soil and the fertilizer, then it's probably because of the pruning. The harder you prune, if they prune them really hard this winter, in this month, next month, if they prune them really hard, they will put on a lot of summer growth. The harder you prune, the more growth you'll get, but the less berries you'll get. But since they haven't been putting on much growth or many berries, that's what they need to do right now. Prune them really hard. Don't expect a lot this summer as far as berries go, but expect a lot of new growth. And that way, the new growth will produce the great berries the following year. So a little harder pruning than you normally would this year.
They're going to be happy to have that answer. I think that they kind of love these blueberries, so they don't want to lose them. And spotted wing Drosophila, I know you covered that topic, and many people were interested in traps. In your garden, I know you have a number of blueberries. How many traps do you put out?
I have 3 rows of blueberries, and there's about 28 blueberries there right now. And I would put out 3 or 4 traps in with them. And
Excellent.
actually, there's a lot of information out there now that says, especially with our weather change, they seem to be hanging around a lot longer. And you can even start putting out traps around November and see if you are catching some of the Drosophila at that time, and just kind of keep changing it and through the winter, and looking at it and see, instead of waiting until the berries are just about ready to come on, start it. And some people do it all year long. Just because of our weather change, those little critters are staying around a lot longer.
Excellent information. I'm sure that all the growers out there are glad to have that. If you're new, if you're gonna just start planting blueberries, what time is the best time to start planting your blueberry plants if you're gonna have a row of blueberries?
Okay, as long as you've checked in that the soil pH is correct before you plant, it could be spring or fall. In this, in the fall is actually a really good time to plant blueberry plants. But as a homeowner, and when we go to the nurseries to purchase our plants, most of the time the new plants coming in the fall, in the spring. That's when the nurseries have got them from the big growers, and that's when they're all either usually potted up in a container, ready to sell to the public. So they'll probably get a better choice of blueberries if they do it in the spring when the ones are just coming out.
Do you
Yeah.
think is
If they're
bare
going to
root?
plant a lot, I'm sorry, what?
Oh, is bare root better than potted?
Not necessarily. For homeowners, and you buy it in a nursery, you'll probably only get it in a container. If you're going to plant a lot of them, you could probably purchase them wholesale from a wholesale nursery, and that way they will be a bare root from them. But not very often do we find them, blueberries, especially bare root, in the nurseries.
If your blueberries are really, really small, are they underwatered? Or do you think there's another problem?
It depends. It the The older the branches that the blueberries are on, and the smaller the branches, the smaller the berries are going to be too.
Oh.
If you have nice long branches and they're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, you'll get a nice cluster of berries. But if you have these little tiny ones and it has a berry bud on it, you think, great, you might get 1 or 2 berries, and they're going to be tinier. So the older the bush gets, the smaller the berries get. If you don't prune it every year, that's kind of what's going to happen.
Got it.
So you want to keep it young, keep pruning. Pruning is such a big part of blueberry production.
Dana says the type of blueberry bush that she has is not right for my climate, and the branches die down to the ground, then come back with just a couple of branches each year. Obviously,
Oh.
there's no berries, and she's wondering, is there any survival for this cultivar, or should she just start over with an appropriate cultivar for her climate?
If she really wants to keep it, I would probably personally start over. But if she really wants to keep it, I would suggest putting it in a container. Get a large container. That way, if it is a colder area, that's why it's not growing well, maybe she can move it into a different area. Maybe she can put it inside of a cold shed for a while, or put something around it, a frost blanket or something, if that's what's causing it. If it's another reason, well, that would probably be the only reason. You know, that list that I gave that people can see of which type of blueberries grow best in our area. And if this person lives in a different area, like you mentioned, I would definitely contact extension agent in their area, find out what they have to say about it.
They can be so very, very helpful.
Oh, they can.
If you inherited a blueberry cultivar and you don't know what it is there a way to find out what it is? Would you go to the extension office? Do they ID it for you?
I know, not really. You might be able to tell a little bit if it has red stems or yellow stems. That might get you to a few different varieties, but the main thing would be the taste. Sometimes I tell people to go to You Pick blueberry farms that have a lot of different varieties. Taste the different varieties. See if you can taste one that says, "Yeah, that's mine," or "No, that's not mine," something like that. But otherwise, you really can't tell.
Okay, that you answered about 3 questions in that one question.
Oh,
Many people move into a place they love their blueberries, but they've no clue what they are because they weren't the purchaser of them. Um,
yeah.
one of my bushes has sunken down, so there is a bowl. So it's kind of
Mm.
sunken. The area
Uh-huh.
drains really well, but should I consider replanting it?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Um, I think it would depend on how much it has sunk, but you could just put some sawdust or some bark
Mulch.
mulch, not right against it, but you could fill in the bowl a little bit. Blueberries they do have some taproot, some big roots, but what they have mostly are the feather roots, which are close to the surface. So if they put some mulch around that bowl, they'll probably start seeing some feather roots start growing in that area. But if it's too deep, if it's more than 6 to 8 inches, I would say maybe you need to dig it up, transplant it, fill it in, get your soil all nice, and try it again. I'd have to see how low it is, I think.
Yeah, it would be kind of a visual.
Yeah.
Okay, what is the harm in mixing mulch into the soil versus it being on the top? I asked because I sell blueberry plants online after I purchased them from Oregon Blueberry, and we repot them. So she kind of wants to know.
Okay. This is a commercial person.
Right.
So really only
They are
supposed
a
to
small
answer
business, so they really need to
gardening
be.
questions. But the one thing that I can say is when we talked about um, mulch means just on top, and amendment means mixing it in. And what you don't want to use when you use an amendment, you don't want to use something that's high in pH. So that I can say. But as far as specific question, she would need to contact a commercial grower and get that answer for them. I can only answer home garden questions.
Right, right. Commercial people, no. Um, my blueberries have been dropping their leaves in the fall and grow through the winter without dropping them. Is this bad? So they regrow and then they don't drop. She's
Some may hold their leaves longer. Sometimes plants that have a certain disease, I can't think of any specifically for blueberries, but I know some plants that hold their leaves when they're not supposed to, it's because they have some type of disease or problem. I also have noticed weather has a lot to do with it. I don't remember whether it was this fall or the last fall. A lot of our trees did not lose their leaves as soon as they normally would. And I said a lot of trees now that I think should have their leaves falling off haven't. So some of it I would say would be environmental reasons. As long as the plant is healthy, I wouldn't worry about it.
John is wondering if he has a 4x8 raised bed, how many blueberries should he plant in that bed?
You want about 2 feet on each side of the blueberries. So if it's only 4 feet, then you would only have one row. You, so that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, I think. That so you couldn't put two side by side on the 4 foot area. You couldn't put two of them in there. That would be probably a little bit closer. Now, saying that, I will say that there's been a lots of different studies that OSU has done, and they have found that you can put blueberries 2.5 feet apart, 3 feet apart, and they still will do well. So if he really wants to put more blueberries in there, he might put them just a little bit closer. They'll be harder to prune. They'll be intertwined with each other a little bit. But a lot of the research showed as long as you're giving them enough water, the nutrients are correct, the soil pH is correct, even having them a little bit closer, it still does work.
Excellent. He'll be happy, I'm thinking. This gal says, my berries are large and delicious, but I often have a lot that don't ripen. Should I thin out the clusters that where there's a lot of late green berries?
No, she probably has a later variety, and later in the season, they're normally would ripen later in the season, but it might just be too late. So no, I just leave them there.
This person wants to know about what is the success ratio if you use blueberry if you start blueberries from cuttings, and what time of the year is that best done?
Trying to think. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. She'll have to write this question in.
And send it
Think
in.
it's August. I know that it's very hard to start blueberry plants, but just kind of like that other lady's question, if you have one plant that you really like and you don't know what it is and you want more of that same one, I would definitely get it a try. There is lots of information out there about how to propagate blueberry plants. You're taking a hardwood or a semi-hardwood cutting, and it'll tell you, you'll need to look up that information. It'll tell you exactly what soil to put it in, how long it's going to take. But one thing people need to remember, the blueberries that we buy in the store and plant are usually 2 or 3 year old plants. So if they started one this year, it's going to be probably 4 or 5 years before they get a crop of blueberries.
Oh, that's yeah. So that's the way it's playing the waiting game.
Something to think about. But hey, it's always fun to try. And
Yeah,
there is a lot of good information out there about how to propagate them.
and you may have said this, Jane, and I was maybe answering a question when you were talking about it, but what about using weed fabric instead of using mulch?
You can. The North Willamette Research Center in Aurora, that's by Oregon State has a research center. They are doing a lot of experimenting, and a lot of them are weed mats instead of the mulch. If you look up some of the information, if you put Oregon State University blueberry research and put Bernadine Strict, she was our berry specialist until she retired, and put her name in there, and there's a lot of information about how their research is going as far as using mats instead of mulch. So that's a great question.
Is triple 16 fertilizer okay to use?
No, because we only want nitrogen. Blueberries really only need nitrogen, and triple 16 has a lot of phosphorus and a lot of potassium, which our soils do not need and the blueberries do not need. They don't like to have too much of that. So nitrogen fertilizers is really all that blueberries need. Now, some people ask me a lot about, well, can I use a rhododendron fertilizer? Because it is an acid fertilizer. And some of the information out there will say, well, if you really need to use it maybe every 3 or 5 years. You put some of that on, but nitrogen is all blueberries need. They get everything else they need from the soil.
And I think you've answered this question, but again, I think a lot of times people inherit or they plant a blueberry and unintentionally gets ignored. I planted an unknown blueberry variety last spring and didn't prune or amend the soil. Is it too late to start doing these things?
No, take the pH, find out whether your pH is too high or too low. It's probably too high, then they'll have to add some elemental sulfur. And depending on how big it is, I talked about your first year in, say they planted it last spring and didn't, this would be just the perfect time to do a little bit of pruning on it. It's probably not very big yet, so they're not going to be doing a lot of pruning. They're not going to be pruning out any old canes because there isn't any old canes in there right now. But they can do a little bit of pruning, a little bit of shaping.
Okay. And one
And
last question,
one
Jane.
other thing. Oh,
Oh,
go
yes.
ahead.
Go ahead and add.
One other thing, I would really suggest watching the 10-minute university video on pruning your blueberry. I have a small plant there that I'm showing exactly how to prune it and then how to prune the larger one. It's nice to actually see a hands-on demonstration versus just seeing photos of it. So I would really recommend people look at that if they need more help with pruning.
That's really a good suggestion. You're right. I have to watch it more than one time. One time doesn't do it for me. I have to rewatch to get it right. This person has 4 blueberry bushes that are about 9 years old, and they've had great harvests, but last year, 0 fruit. And they're wondering if this is a soil pH problem, or did they prune too late? They would like to avoid that problem this year.
Last year was not the best blueberry. We had so much rain and things last year in 2023, the spring of 2023. A lot of things did not get pollinated. I've heard from a lot of people with blueberries that last year they just didn't have a as large of, they just didn't get pollinated. They had a lot of buds, but they didn't end up with a lot of, and they had a lot of flowers, but didn't end up with a lot of berries. So it probably was just environmental last year.
And it was, and our fall was so long. Our spring was so cold and wet, and our fall was so late.
Yeah.
Do you have time for one more, Jane?
I think we have time for one more.
There's so many people with questions. This person bought a house in Portland last spring with a few mature blueberry bushes, and although it was early summer, was robust. They were robust, but she didn't really water them very well throughout the summer. And she's wondering if she can expect a harvest this year since she didn't really water them last year during the growing season.
She needs to go out and look at them because the berry buds are forming now. When you see a branch, the berry buds are always on the tip and it'll be larger. Then they'll see these little buds down. Those are going to be the leaf buds. She'll be able to go out there and actually look at her bush and say, oh, I do have some berries. I do have berry buds right now. Uh, just water them the way they need to be watered this summer. Even if they didn't get watered last year, they might slow down a bit, but they should come out of it. Start
Okay.
taking care of them now, and they should do good.
Yeah, that's always good news. You can save them, right?
They're pretty good. They're hardy little plants. They really are.
You've answered a lot of questions and you did a great presentation, Jane. Everybody appreciates it, I know, but I also know there are a number of people who didn't get their question answered. And as we said in the beginning, if we didn't answer your question and you still want it answered, use the email that's in the video link and you can send your question to us and we will get the answers.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.